Muy buenos días, muy buenas
Good
tardes. Le
morning, good
damos la más cordial
afternoon.
bienvenida al
We
conversatorio
welcome you with the
Herencia
warmest of
Ancestral, Pueblo
greetings with the
Originario y
conversation
Afrodescendientes en El Salvador. Un espacio necesario para
Ancestral
reflexionar
Heritage,
sobre
Native
cómo
peoples,
el
and
racismo se
Afro-descendants in El Salvador.
manifiesta
A
y se
necessary space to reflect on
sostiene
how
en la
racism is
sociedad
manifested and
salvadoreña,
sustained in
como
Salvadorian
para
society,
visibilizar la
as well as to
resistencia y
make
la lucha
visible the
que han
resistance and
liderado las
struggles
comunidades
that historically
históricamente
excluded
excluidas.
communities have
Mi
led.
nombre es Yanira Arias,
My name
soy
is
la
Yanira
coordinadora
Arias. I'm the
vicemigrante
coordinator of
para
Migrant
Alianza
Justice
Américas.
for Alianza
Quisiera
Americas.
reconocer que este evento
I would
es
like to recognize that this
coorganizado
event is
por el Seminario
co-organized
Permanente
by the
Mirta Colón
Permanent
y Azul
Seminar
Originario
Mirta
y
Colón and Azul
co-convocado
Originario,
por la Organización Mundial
co-convened by
Centroamericana,
the Central
ONECA,
American Black
y el Foro
Organization,
Centroamericano de
ONECA, and the
Mujeres
Central American
en
Women's
la
Forum, and
18ª
the
Conferencia
18th
de Mujeres
Conference of
Afro-Centroamericanas y
Afro-Central
Diáspora.
American and Diaspora
Agradecemos
Women.
profundamente a estas
We are
organizaciones por
deeply
impulsar
grateful to these
espacios que promueven el
organizations for
reconocimiento,
promoting
la dignidad y
spaces
la
that foster
justicia por
recognition,
los
dignity, and
afrodescendientes e
justice for
indígenas.
Afro-descendant
Presentamos
and
brevemente
indigenous
a
peoples.
nuestras
We
invitadas y
briefly
nuestro invitado.
introduce
Para
our
nosotras
guests.
es
For
motivo
us,
de
it
sumo honor
is a
recibir el
great
día de hoy
honor
a
to
Ivy
receive
Gutiérrez,
today Ivy
afro-indígena
Gutierrez,
salvadoreña.
Afro-Indigenous
Ivy es
Salvadorian.
psicóloga y
Ivy is
miembro
a
del equipo de la
psychologist and team
Asociación
member
Azul
of the
Originario,
Asociación
AZO.
Azul Originario, AZO.
Está especializada
She
en terapia individual y
specializes in
intergrupal con
individual,
enfoque en
family, and
derechos
group
humanos, salud
therapy with a
mental
focus on
y
human
justicia
rights, mental
social.
health,
Su labor se
and
centra
social
en el
justice. Her
acompañamiento
work
emocional de
focuses
personas
on
en situación de
emotional
vulnerabilidad,
accompaniment of people
especialmente
in
en
vulnerable
contextos
situations,
de
especially
crisis y trauma.
in contexts of
Posteriormente vamos a
crisis and
conocer a
trauma.
Mirna Elizabeth
Later, we will
Hernández,
meet Mirna
indígena
Elizabeth
salvadoreña,
Hernandez,
originaria del
a
municipio
Salvadoran
de
indigenous
Huayúa,
woman
en el
from
departamento de
the
Sonsonate.
Huayua
Como lideresa,
municipality in
ha
the
dedicado su vida a
Sonsonate
fortalecer la
department.
identidad
She
cultural
has
de su
dedicated her
pueblo
life to
y a
strengthen
preservar las
her
costumbres y
uh,
saberes
people's
ancestrales,
culture and to
manteniendo una
foster
profunda conexión
ancestral
con
knowledge,
las y los
keeping deep
abuelos de
connection
su
with
comunidad.
the
Actualmente
forefathers of
forma
her
parte de la
community.
comunidad
She is part
indígena
of the indigenous
Nahua Ohana,
Nawa
Wayúa,
community, Wayua
Sinajú,
Nawa, Sinahu
desde donde impulsa la lucha
community, from
contra
where she
la
drives the
discriminación,
struggle
la
against
violación de derechos y
discrimination,
la
the violation of human
invisibilización
rights,
que
and the
enfrentan las mujeres
invisibilization
indígenas.
that indigenous
Y
women
finalmente,
face.
nuestro
And
próximo panelista
finally,
será
our next
Heriberto
panelist will be
Erquicia,
Heriberto
doctor
Erquicia.
en
He's a
historia
doctor
de
in
la
history
Universidad
from the
Pablo
University
de Olavide, Sevilla,
Pablo de
España,
Olavide
y
in
máster en
Seville,
historia por la
Spain,
misma universidad.
master's in history from the same university.
Entre sus
Among
investigaciones más
his
relevantes
more
están los
relevant
estudios sobre la época
research,
colonial, las
studies on
relaciones
colonial times,
interétnicas y las identidades
inter-ethnic
culturales
relations,
en El
and
Salvador
cultural
y en
identities in
Centroamérica.
El Salvador
Fue
and in Central
director del
America.
Museo Nacional de
He was
Antropología
director of the
por
National
J.
Museum of
Usman entre
Anthropology, Dr.
2014
David
al
J.
2019
Guzman,
y
from
actualmente
2014 to
dirige el
2019, and
Centro de
currently
Investigación de la
directs
Universidad Pedagógica de
the
El Salvador,
Pedagogical
UPED.
University of El Salvador's
Gracias
Research
por
Center.
acompañarnos hoy. Que antes
Thank you
de
for joining
comenzar
us
quiero
today.
recordarles que
Before
tenemos servicio de
beginning today, I
interpretación
would like to remind you
disponible
that we
para
have
quienes desean
interpretation
escuchar la
services available
conversación
for
en
those who would
inglés.
like to hear the
Vean en la
conversation
parte
in
inferior de su
English.
pantalla,
You can look at the bottom
hacer clic en el
side of
globo
your screen,
y
click
seleccionar
on the
inglés.
globe, and choose
Brevemente voy a
English.
decirlo en inglés para
I
quienes
will say
desean
this briefly in
acompañarnos hoy si
English
desean
for
esta
those that are
función. I
accompanying
just
in
wanted to
English.
remind for everyone attending today, and if you would like to listen this conversation in English, we have interpretation available. Go to the bottom of the screen, click on the glove and select English to continue to listen and also to interact in English with our panelists. Les recordamos a la audiencia que pueden hacer sus
We
preguntas por
remind the
medio de la
audience that
caja de
you can
QIA,
ask
hacer las
questions through the
preguntas. Ya
Q&A
tendremos una sección
box. We will
específicamente
have
para escuchar
a
sus
section
comentarios y
specific to
preguntas.
listen to your
Por el
comments and
momento, pues
questions. For the
empecemos
time
con
being,
la
let's
conversación, el
begin
diálogo que
with the
tenemos con nuestras
conversation,
personas
this
panelistas.
dialogue with our
Queremos
panelists.
partir de una
We want to
pregunta
begin
recurrente
from
cuando se
a
habla
recurrent
de este
question
tema.
when we talk about this
¿Cómo
topic.
se manifiesta el
How
racismo en El
is
Salvador?
racism
Desde su
present in El
perspectiva. Quiero
Salvador from your
recordarle a las personas
perspective? I
panelistas
want to
que
remember the
tienen entre
panelists
2 o un
that you
máximo de 3
have
minutos
two
para responder
tops
las
3 minutes
Vamos a
to
comenzar
respond to the questions.
con Ivy para la pregunta. Les
We'll
repito la
begin
pregunta. ¿Cómo
with
se manifiesta el
Ivy. How
racismo
does
en El
racism manifest
Salvador desde
itself in
su
El
perspectiva?
Salvador from
Adelante.
your perspective? Go ahead.
Buenos días, mucho
Good
gusto.
morning.
Gracias
Nice
por
to
este
meet you.
espacio.
Thank you for
Me
this
gustaría
space.
mencionar que el
I would like
racismo
to
en El
point
Salvador se
out that
manifiesta de
racism in El
diferentes
Salvador
perspectivas o de
appears in
diferentes
different
maneras.
ways,
Ya
in
puede ser
perspectives.
a
It
nivel
could
colectivo
be
con los pueblos
collectively with
afrodescendientes
the
y también
Afro-descendant
puede ser de
peoples
una
and
manera
also
individual.
individually
A lo largo de la historia, pues el no
through
reconocimiento de
history,
las
the
poblaciones
non-recognition
afrodescendientes
of
en El Salvador
Afro-descendant peoples in
ha
El
llevado a
Salvador
que se aumente la
has
brecha de las desigualdades y el
made
incumplimiento de
inequality
los derechos
gaps
para estas poblaciones.
widen in
Por
the
ejemplo,
vulnerability of the rights of
siempre
the
cuando
rights
se
of the
pregunta
peoples.
dónde están los pueblos indígenas,
Whenever
la
the
gente
indigenous
siempre
people
tiene
are
una
asked
respuesta
about, people
y
always
que
have an
muchas veces
answer,
también está
which
equivocada y hace
often is
referencia a los
mistaken and
territorios donde se
references
encuentran
the
nuestras hermanas
territories
y hermanos
where
indígenas, pero
our
cuando preguntamos
indigenous
dónde
brothers
están
and
las poblaciones
sisters are at, but
afrodescendientes,
when we ask about
existe una
Afro-descendant
negativa.
peoples, there's
Todavía se maneja a
negation
nivel
to that.
colectivo la idea de que en El
Collectively,
Salvador
the
no
idea
existen las
that
personas
there are
afrodescendientes
no
y lo
Afro-descendants
atribuyen
in El
a
Salvador is
ciertas
attributed
políticas
to
que
certain
gobiernos del pasado
policies that
implementaron,
governments
que es
in the
parte
past
de
implemented,
nuestra
which is
memoria
part
colectiva,
of our
pero
collective
también se
memory.
manifiestan
However,
expresiones de racismo a
expressions of
nivel
racism
individual
are
y
also
que son bien
expressed
evidentes o que ya
individually,
tenemos
which are very
interiorizadas
evident
o las
or
hemos
we have
naturalizado,
interiorized or
como por
we've
ejemplo
naturalized,
hacer
for
referencias,
example, to
burlas o
reference
comentarios despectivos
jokingly,
hacia el
mockingly, or
estereotipo afrodescendiente de
despectively
las
against
personas,
the
como el color de
Afro-descendant
la piel,
stereotypes of people,
la
like the color of
textura
the
del
skin,
cabello,
the
eh,
texture
las
of
personas
their
que
hair,
ya hemos
the people
adoptado
who
el
have
estereotipo de la vestimenta
adopted the stereotype
afrodescendiente.
of
Existen
the
burlas también
Afro-descendant
al tipo de
clothing.
vestimenta
There's
que
mocking
no es muy
regarding
común
that
en
type
este
of
país.
clothing, which is not
Y
very common
pues
in this
tipos de
country.
discriminación
And
que
well,
todavía
types
se
of
manifiestan en
discrimination
algunas
that are
instituciones
still
como en los centros
clear,
escolares.
such
Lo hemos
as
trabajado desde
in
Azul
different institutions,
Originario
such
con
as
la niñez
schools.
y la
We've worked with
adolescencia,
childhood
que
from
también es
Azul
una población
Originario with
importante
children
con la
and
que hay
teenagers
que
because
trabajar.
this is
Y
an
las niñas y
important
los
population
niños
to
con
work with, and boys and
características
girls
físicas
with their
afrodescendientes siguen
Afro-descendant
siendo
characteristics keep
objeto de
being
burla, siguen
subjected
siendo
to
víctimas de
mockery,
bullying por
victims
su
of
color de piel, por
bullying
su
because of the color
cabello,
of their
y esto lleva
skin,
también a
the
que las
color of their
niñas, niños y
hair, and
adolescentes
this
no
makes it
quieran
so that boys,
reconocerse
girls, and
y no
teenagers don't
quieran
want to
indagar acerca de
recognize
sus raíces
themselves
afrodescendientes.
or
¿Por qué?
ask
Porque no quieren
regarding
ser
their
parte
Afro-descendant
de un
roots
colectivo
because they
que es
don't want to be part of a
estigmatizado,
collective that is
discriminado.
stigmatized,
El
discriminated
caso de
on.
las
And
mujeres
in the case
también,
of women,
lo más
also,
común es
the more common
la discriminación
is
por
the
nuestro cabello.
discrimination
Siempre
because of
en
our
los salones
hair,
de belleza,
in
siempre
the hair
la alternativa
salons,
que se
the
les ofrece a las
alternative that
mujeres
is
con
offered
el
to
cabello afro
women
o
with
con el cabello
afro
ondulado
hair
es el
or
alisado.
curly
Y
hair
todos estos
is
productos con
to
formol que dañan el cabello de
lose the
las mujeres,
curls
pero
using
como
formol that
están
harms women's
bombardeados
hair
constantemente de
because
que el
we've been
cabello
bombarded
perfecto o
that the
que el cabello
perfect
correcto y
hair, the
ordenado
correct
es
and
el cabello
organized
liso,
hair is
pues seguimos
straight hair.
recurriendo
So
a
we
estos
keep
tratamientos
recurring to these
para formar
treatments so
parte
as
de
to
ese colectivo
be
que
a
sí
part
tiene
of
el
that
cabello
collective
ordenado,
that
porque se
has
nos ha hecho creer
organized
que el
hair
cabello
because we've made to
colocho es el
believe that
cabello
curly hair
desordenado y
is
que no está
disorganized,
dentro de los
disordered,
estándares
and not
de la
inside
belleza.
the beauty
Igual siempre
standards,
observamos
the standards of beauty. And
en
we
los
always
requisitos
we
de un
also
perfil de
see
trabajo que
in
dice buena
the requirements
presentación, pero
for
cuando las empresas
work
hacen
opportunities, they
referencia a
talk
la
about good
buena
presentation.
presentación,
When they
es a
mention good
cumplir con estándares
presentation,
de
is to
belleza blancos.
fulfill
Y
white beauty
la buena
standards.
presentación no
And
acepta a
good
las personas
presentation does not
morenas,
accept
colochas y con
people of darker
características
skin, curly
afrodescendientes o
hair, and
indígenas.
Afro-descendant
Lo
or
vemos en los
indigenous
centros
characteristics.
comerciales
We
también,
see
ese
these at
racismo
shopping centers,
bien
very
interiorizado ya y
interiorized
cuando
racism.
en el supermercado,
in
en
the
las tiendas,
supermarket
el
or in the
vigilante le decide a la
stores,
persona que es morena,
the uh,
en todos los
people
anaqueles
who
o en
are
todos los pasillos
watching
de las
over
tiendas, que está
follow
pendiente de qué está haciendo las
people with
personas
darker skin
que son morenas,
more,
pero las personas que
and
son,
they're
tienen tono de
aware of
piel
what
blanco
darker
más
skinned
claro,
people are
ahí
doing,
están
but those
súper
that
seguidos.
have clearer
Igual, pues,
skin are not
esta discriminación ha
chased or followed
llegado
over. This
al tema de
discrimination
justicia en
has
el
reached
que
the
el
justice
perfil
system in
racial
which the racial
es
profile
asociado al cometimiento de
associated with
delitos
the
y las
commitment of
personas que están
crimes
como más
and the
vulnerables a
people that are
ser
more
encarceladas
vulnerable to
injustamente
be
son
jailed
las personas
unfairly,
con
unjustly, are
características o con
people
el
with
fenotipo
characteristics or
afrodescendiente.
Afro-descendant
Creo
phenotypes.
que ya tomé el
I
tiempo.
think I have taken my time.
Gracias, Ivy, por
Esa es mi
recordarnos la
participación.
importancia
Thank
de la
you
raza y
for
el sexo en diferentes
reminding
espacios de
us
la
of the
vida
importance of racialism,
de día a día. Así
racialization in
vamos a
everyday
hablar con usted,
life. We're
Mirna. Le
going
repito
to
nuevamente
go
la
with Mirna
pregunta:
now.
¿cómo
Once
se
again, the
manifiesta
question,
el
Mirna,
racismo
is
en El Salvador
how does
desde su
racism
perspectiva? Adelante.
manifest in El
Buenos
Salvador
días,
from
mi
your
nombre es Mirna
perspective? Go
Elizabeth
ahead. Good morning. My
Hernández,
name is
líder
Mirna Elizabeth
indígena
Hernandez.
de
I'm an
Coahuila.
indigenous leader
Bueno,
from
creo que
Mollego.
desde mi
I believe that
perspectiva,
from my
creo que
perspective, I think
la discriminación siempre se ha dado
discrimination
acá en El
is always
Salvador
taking
por
place
ser,
in El
mayormente por ser
Salvador,
mujeres y por ser
mostly for being
indígenas.
women and being
Escuchaba a la
indigenous.
compañera,
I
¿verdad?
was
Donde
listening
ella
to
dice
our
que
colleague when she's
por
saying
nuestro color de
that
piel, por
because of our
nuestra
color of
estatura
skin, our
y
height,
en fin, siempre la población
and
indígena
the
siempre ha
indigenous
sido
population
discriminada
has always been discriminated on.
en el ámbito del laboral,
In
aún
the
en las escuelas,
workspaces,
nuestros niños,
in the
nuestras niñas,
schools, our
por el
children, our
origen de ellos.
girls, because of their
Y
origin, are
creo
discriminated.
que la falta de
And I
oportunidades
believe
se
that
debe
the
a la
lack
misma
of
discriminación,
opportunities
¿verdad?
is
Porque cuando
part
se
of the
dice
same
que es mujer,
discrimination,
que es
because
indígena,
whenever
porque
they
la mujer
say
siempre tiene que
a
estar
woman is
sumisa a lo
indigenous,
que el esposo
and
dice o a lo que
because
el
the
jefe
indigenous woman
del
has
hogar
to be submitted to what
es lo que ellos
their
pretenden,
husband
¿verdad? Que siempre por ser mujeres debemos de estar
says,
ahí
and
porque
that's what they
esa es
pretend,
la
and that's where we
enseñanza.
should be because we're women, and
Y
that's
si
the
nosotros
teaching.
decimos
And if we
lo que es en lo
say
laboral, igual.
in the
En las
works, we talk about the
escuelas, los
workspaces in
niños y las niñas
schools,
también
boys and
sufren esa
girls also
discriminación. Cuando son
suffer from
niñas,
this
ya tienen
discrimination
una cierta
when they're
edad hasta la
girls
que ya
and
su edad
they are
para
of
estudiar,
certain
porque son
age
mujeres, tienen que
until the
quedarse
age
en
they are
casa,
able to study, because
¿verdad?
if they're
Entonces,
women, they have to stay home.
creo que la
So
discriminación
I
en
think
todo aspecto,
discrimination
pues
in
por ser
every
mujeres,
aspect,
por
because
venir de
we're
comunidades
women,
indígenas,
because we're coming from
por
indigenous
ser de
communities,
escasos
because
recursos,
we
y la verdad es de que
have
esto
scarce resources,
influye mucho en
and
la
that
sociedad,
has a strong
porque
influence in
no hay
society,
participación en
because
espacios
there's no
públicos.
participation in public spaces.
Ellos siempre van viendo,
They
¿verdad?
are always
Un estatus
looking for a
que la
status
sociedad
that
ve que
society
la comunidad indígena
sees the indigenous
no
community
entra
doesn't fit
en
in
esas áreas.
those
Y
areas.
mayormente,
And
pues, cuando
mostly,
se dan oportunidades
whenever
o en las
opportunities appear,
organizaciones,
even in
nosotros vemos
the
esa discriminación,
organizations, we see
porque
in our
no se les
organizations,
da
we
esos
see the
espacios,
discrimination
sino que
because the
vemos a las
spaces are
comunidades
not given. We
como
see communities
quizás como un trabajo que
as
se tiene que
perhaps
hacer, pero
work to
estos
be
espacios
done,
así
but
en
these
las comunidades no se dan
spaces in
mayormente a
the
las mujeres.
communities, they don't really
Y
happen
eso
mostly for
es lo
women.
que hace
That
a Azul
is that
Originario, creo,
makes Azul Originario, I
muy
believe,
diferente,
very different,
porque sí toman en cuenta a
because
las
yes, they do
mujeres
take women
de
into
las
account,
comunidades,
women in the
¿verdad? Porque
communities
estos
into
espacios
account,
no siempre
because
se
these
dan.
spaces
Estos
don't
espacios,
always
por
take
ser
place.
mujeres,
These spaces,
creo que
because we're
no los
women,
tenemos.
I don't think we have them.
Y yo creo que
So, and I think it's good.
que
It's good
nosotros como
that
mujeres también
we as women
demostremos
as
y con nuestras
well
mayores y nuestros
show
mayores,
with
porque
our
si venimos de
elders
comunidades
also,
indígenas,
because if we're coming
tenemos
from
esos
indigenous
conocimientos,
communities,
esos
we have that
saberes,
know-how,
esas
that
prácticas que
knowledge,
muchos
those
desconocen,
practices that many
¿verdad?
don't
Nosotros
know
hacíamos
of.
comentarios con unos
We
abuelos
were
y
talking
abuelas y
with
decíamos
some
nosotros, miren, las
elders,
abuelas cómo curaban
grandparents, and
antes,
say, look, how
pero
did
ahora si
grandmothers
se cura de
cure,
empacho o se
heal
cura
things
de
before?
ojo, ya es
But if
brujería. Y
they
esa es parte de la
they
discriminación
talk
que las
about
mujeres están sufriendo,
empachos or
porque nuestras
evil
abuelas
eye, they're
asistían los
discriminated
empachos.
on. because our
Entonces, ya ahora
grandmothers
con
would
esa
tend to
discriminación, y si se hace,
births.
pues ya,
And with that
ya
discrimination,
eso
if
es
this
penado por ley.
happens,
Y
it's
estos conocimientos
prohibited by law.
son muy
And you
importantes,
can be penalized
muy
for that. And that
importantes
knowledge is
que
very,
las
that
mujeres
know-how is very
ya
important
traen
that
o traemos,
women
¿verdad? Porque
that we
tenemos
bring
muchas
already,
mujeres
because
jóvenes
we have
que
many
tienen esos
young women
conocimientos,
that
no
have that
porque hayan ido a
know-how,
una
not because
universidad,
they went to a
sino que
university,
ya lo
but
traen, esa
they already
herencia de
have
nuestras
it. They
abuelas
have
y de nuestros
inherited this from our grandmothers and
y
grandfathers.
creo que con esa discriminación
And I think
se
with
les,
that
como que se les estanca.
discrimination,
A ellos se
I
les
think
sostiene esa
people are
sabiduría,
stuck
ese
and they
conocimiento no
that
no
knowledge
lleva a la
is
práctica,
detained,
¿verdad? Porque la misma
stopped. It doesn't go
discriminación
into
no
practice
permite
because
que
the
se desarrollen
discrimination
como
itself
mujeres
doesn't
o
allow
como
women to
hombres también.
develop and
Así es
men
que yo creo
to
que
develop
nosotros
as such.
sufrimos
So
mucha
I think we
discriminación
suffer lots
como
of
el afrodescendiente,
discrimination, such as the
¿verdad? Y por
Afro-descendant.
la misma discriminación es que casi
And
nadie
because of
dice
that
yo soy indígena.
discrimination, no one says
Para
I'm
encajar,
indigenous.
decimos.
To fit
Porque si
in, we
vemos
say,
jóvenes que vienen
because
de
if we see
comunidades
young
indígenas,
people
ellos
coming
dicen
from
no.
indigenous
A
communities,
veces no quieren
they
decir
say
ni que vienen
no.
de un cantón
Sometimes they
por la
don't
misma
even want to
discriminación,
say they're coming
por
from
el
a community
rechazo
because of that
hacia los
discrimination,
demás.
because of the
Entonces,
rejection against
yo
others,
creo
from
que
others.
eso es
So I
hay,
think
habría
this
ir
we would have
rompiendo ya
to really break
esas
down
discriminaciones
those forms
para
of
que nuestra juventud
discrimination
ya
so
se
as
pueda
our
identificar, se
youth
sienta
might
orgullosa
identify
de
and
su
feel
origen, de sus
proud of
raíces,
their origin,
porque
of their roots.
como indígenas
Because
creo que
as
no es para
indigenous,
sentirnos quizás
I
menos,
don't think this is
nos
something that
vean
shouldn't make us feel
que
less than
nosotros
anybody
no
else,
sabemos hacer las cosas y
that
nosotros
to be seen as we
comentábamos y
don't know how to
decían
do
unos
things.
abuelos,
And
miren, un
some
ejemplo lo que
elders
está
were
sucediendo
saying the
con
other
eso
day, an
de la carretera.
example with that, what's happening with the
Nuestros
road.
antepasados
Our
no
forefathers,
eran arquitectos.
the foremothers were not
Y si nosotros
architects.
vemos las
And
pirámides,
if we see,
vemos
we look at the
trabajos
pyramids, we
bien hechos,
see
pero
very
es la
well
misma
done
sabiduría,
work,
es lo mismo
but
que
it's
se
the
les enseña.
same
No se les
know-how,
está
and that
dando la
is what is being
oportunidad
discriminated on.
a que
The
ellos
opportunity for
manifiesten,
them to
demuestren la gran
show
capacidad que el
of
Creador
their
nos ha
great
dado,
abilities that the
¿verdad? Así es
Creator
que
has given us.
yo sé que
So
poco
I
a poco
know
y con
that bit
estas
by bit
participaciones,
and
yo
with
sé
these
que
participations,
pues
I know
vamos a seguir
that we
adelante.
will
Nuestra lucha
continue
también
forward, and
como
so
mujeres,
will
ahí
we,
la
our
llevamos día a
struggle
día.
as women.
No es
We
fácil
keep on
por
with
ser
it every
mujeres,
day. It's not
por ser
easy for being
indígenas,
women because we're indigenous,
pero
but
nosotros nunca hemos desistido
we
a nuestra
have
lucha.
never
Nosotros
renounced
creo
our
que a
struggle.
pesar de
I
tantas
believe that
dificultades y
even though we
experiencias
face so
malas que
many
hemos vivido,
difficulties and terrible
pero
experiences we've
la misma
survived,
fortaleza, la
the
misma, porque el
same
indígena es
strength,
fuerte.
because the
El
indigenous
indígena
person
no
is
se
strong.
corre
The
como
indigenous
decimos, a la
person
primera,
doesn't shy
¿verdad? El
away
indígena
at the
trata de
first
superar,
chance.
se cae,
Indigenous
pero se
people
levanta
tries
y
to
sigue
overcome
adelante.
this. Might fall down, but will
Quizás
continue,
en medio de
perhaps
tantas
amongst
lágrimas,
so many tears.
y yo creo que hasta aquí.
I think I'll stop here.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Apreciamos mucho su
We really
respuesta,
appreciate your answer.
porque nos pone en perspectiva.
It
Usted brinda diferentes
puts
aspectos de cómo la
different
presión social juega un
aspects
rol
into perspective on how
fundamental en lo que
social
es
pressure
el
plays a
racismo y la
fundamental role
discriminación
on
hacia las personas
racism
de los
and
pueblos originarios.
discrimination
Nos
against
ilustra
the
bastante
people,
la manera bien
originary people.
específica en la que
And
usted
it
ha
shows a
puntualizado algunos
specific way
espacios
in
donde
how the
tanto
spaces
las mujeres como
where
la
women
juventud
and
indígena
youth,
sufrieron este tipo
indigenous youth,
de racismo y
suffers
discriminación.
these forms of
Ahora le
racism
abrimos el
and
espacio a usted,
discrimination. We'll
Heriberto.
yield the floor
Nuevamente la
now
misma
to you,
pregunta, ¿cómo se
Heriberto.
manifiesta el
Once
racismo
again,
en
the
El
question,
Salvador?
how
Gracias.
does racism appear in El Salvador from your perspective? Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. Greetings to everyone, and a huge embrace to our colleague Mirna, who is with us, and that she should know that from the Academy, we accompany indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant peoples in El Salvador and other populations as well that are important. She has mentioned it already. Women and others that are different, is what she has said, that are assumed different according to society. So based in the question, what I wanted to, well, racism in El Salvador is structural. First of all, racism is a social construction and political construction. No one is born a racist. The child has 1 or 2 days. They're not racist. They are built racist through a process in school, a process of interacting with others, and obviously there is a social component, social and political component. And in El Salvador, obviously, our colleagues Ivy and Mirna have said it, there's a socioeconomic ethnic racism. It's socioeconomic ethnic racism because if you look indigenous or Afro-descendant, but also if you are living in the field, in the rural area, and you are also excluded from the world. And this all has to do with the perspective of the nation state built with that concept of modernity, that in order to be an modern individual in that national state, they would have to stop being indigenous, Afro-descendant, talk, dress, think like indigenous or Afro-descendant. And obviously, and Mirna said it very clearly, it's not only the fact of being indigenous, but also being woman, and that's all the other differences: indigenous, LGBT plus, all of this in a vision of a heteropatriarchal society that dominates us, and it's the one we somehow want to be not something homogeneous, but rather a heterogeneous society. We can all live together, and that everyone is being respected for who they are, not what they've taught us, the color of the skin, and all the other things our colleagues have mentioned. Obviously, when we're talking about racism, it's in the language, it's present almost omnipresently in the mainstream media. If you go to any mainstream media, any social network, you will see the huge amount of texts, racist language and racist text, even from any space. And on the other hand, also, there's obviously racism from power, from the state, economic, political power. Why? Because public policies in this country are not focused. Well, right now, only the Constitution, according to the Constitution of the Republic, and according to the Article 63, only the indigenous communities are recognized. And where are the Afro-descendant communities? The indigenous communities have been invisibilized, but the Afro-descendant communities have been denied, which are completely different perceptions. It's almost as if they didn't exist. If it was not because of the census, but regarding the existence of and the recognition of the Constitution to include these peoples, and also to understand something important is that from the academic world, there's also lots of conflict. From the academic world, it is thought that what is indigenous or Afro-descent is something from the past, only that is only at the source, but not in our present. And of course, it is in our present. It is in everything in our present, all of our culture. On the other hand, we could say that to wrap up, I think it's important to go to ensure that this state, everything that is being done from the organizations, from the academy, even the institutions of the state, have to be linked to public intercultural public policies. I cannot understand others, the other, if I do not understand their world vision. So from the academic space, from the urban space, so that one might understand the rural space and the world vision there, we have to dialogue and to try to understand how is it possible that healing with certain herbs is no longer allowed, or the use of midwives, when this has been an important process in the building of our society. And finally, is to understand the others. And this is what we should be looking at. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Heriberto, por
Thank you very much,
agregarme
Heriberto,
todos estos
for
elementos.
clearing out
Entiendo que también en El
these
Salvador
elements.
tenemos
I
muchas
understand that
personas
in El
inmigrantes
Salvador, we also have
de otros
lots of
países
people who
que
have
son
migrated
de
from
origen
other
afro o
countries
indígena. Y
of
los elementos
Afro
que
or
usted
Indigenous
agregaba,
descent,
tanto
and
la
the
compañera
elements you have
Mirna
included,
Ivy,
such
¿verdad?
as
Género, clase, los
Evie and
elementos
Mirna.
que significa todo esto al final
The
también
question is,
determinante y cómo lo
what
vemos como
is
un espejo
this
de estas políticas
that we
represivas
see a mirror of these repressive policies,
principios supremacistas que son
supremacist
la que
principles,
se
and
conjugan mucho con todo
xenophobic
lo que usted nos
that
ayudó
coincides with
a
everything
poner en
you've
perspectiva.
allowed
La
to
segunda
put into
pregunta que
perspective. The
tenemos,
second question we
voy a
have,
pedirle
I'm
a
going to
que
request
nos ayuden tanto Ivy como Mirna
Ivy and Mirna
a comprenderlo un poco
to
más,
understand this a little bit better.
tema.
Understand this topic a little
Los
bit better.
principales
What are the
obstáculos
main
que
obstacles
enfrentan hoy las
that
comunidades
communities are the
afrodescendientes e
Afro-descendant communities
indígenas
and
para
indigenous
que
communities
sus
are facing
derechos sean
today, so
plenamente
that their
reconocidos y
rights are
garantizados? Vamos a
completely
comenzar con Ivy
recognized
y
and
después vamos
guaranteed?
con
We're going to
Mirna.
begin with
Adelante.
Evie, and then we're going to go with Mirna. Go ahead.
Bueno, en El Salvador
Well, in El Salvador, the first obstacle perhaps is the lack of recognition at a constitutional level. Because if we are not recognized in the Constitution of the Republic, Afro-descendant peoples don't exist. And for this reason, the governments and the institutions don't drive public policies focusing on attention and the needs of Afro-descent peoples, and it makes access to health, access to education, to a dignified house more difficult. And also the immaterial patrimony, the ancestral heritage of Afro-descendant peoples. We don't have, we could say, a market where the gastronomy of Afro-descendant peoples exists, or how we dress, and that we could say I could go somewhere and come together with our story, with our ancestrality, and also this lack of recognition perpetuates discrimination and racism against Afro-descendant populations. The structural social issues that affect Afro-descendant peoples also, as it was mentioned, the access to housing, access to work, discrimination is also part of these gaps and these obstacles, because many people of Afro descent, because of the hair, because they weren't following up on guidelines they provide and how these might be seen, and they have difficulties in their employment also. There's people who have been fired from their employment, for example, men with afro hair for not cutting it and to fulfill those guidelines. Guidelines have been fired from their employment, as women for not using organized straight hair. We also have difficulties with the ownership of the land, tenants of the land. There's no access to people to say, we're going to continue with ancestral heritage, just like in indigenous peoples, to heal with herbs and to know which are the ancestral medicine from our grandmothers, gastronomy, and in the beaches, for example, are being overexploited. There's people of Afro descent in Sonsonate, which is the territory where I live. There are beaches where Afro-descendant women have their businesses, which we call here small ranches where they sold seafood with recipes that are not considered of Afro descent, but have been inherited by our foremothers. And everything that deals with consumerism and these hotels and restaurants that have installed around the beaches, these people have been displaced and their businesses have been destroyed, which also has an impact on the economy of the families and affects the scope of other resources that families could have and it's not being tended, and there are no programs focused on the improvement of these people because of the fact that they are not recognized. Access to mental health, which is something that is rarely spoken about, is not a public debate issue, but is also important. No one ever talks about transgenerational trauma that we have inherited in our DNA from our foremothers and forefathers that were forced or enslaved, that were stolen from Africa and brought to these lands. And all of this pain that exists in our DNA, no one has shown us how to heal it. Why? Because the transgenerational trauma is rarely spoken about, and so many situations that could be mentioned.
Gracias, Ivy.
Thank you,
Vamos con
Ivy.
usted.
We're going to go
Mirna,
with you now,
vamos
Mirna.
a
We're
continuar con
going to
la misma pregunta
continue
con usted.
with the
Otra
same
vez se le
question
repito,
with
¿cuáles
you,
son
and
los
I'll repeat the
principales
question. What are
obstáculos
the
que
main
enfrentan hoy las comunidades
impacts
afrodescendientes
that
e
the
indígenas
Afro-descendant
para que sus
people and
derechos
indigenous people are
sean
facing
plenamente
today so that their
reconocidos y
rights
garantizados?
might be
Bueno, uno de los
fulfilled
obstáculos
and
como
guaranteed?
pueblos
One of the
indígenas
obstacles
también
as indigenous people
hay un
is that there is
pero
a
no hay una
recognition,
ratificación.
but no
Entonces, es
ratification.
como un padre que reconozca a
So
su
it's
hijo,
like
pero lo
a
deja al olvido, ¿verdad?
parent that
Es como
recognizes a
que no
child,
tuviéramos ningún
but
derecho,
forgets
porque
about them.
aparecemos,
It's almost as if we didn't have any rights because
aparecemos
we
como
appear
reconocidos,
as
pero nosotros no
recognized,
tenemos
but
ningún derecho.
we have no
O sea,
rights.
se quedaron así solo
So
en la
it's left
ratificación,
at that, it's just a
pero
ratification.
siempre
But
tenemos
we always
que las
try,
comunidades en el abandono no se ha
we always have
incluido el
communities
idioma en la currícula
in
del Ministerio de
abandonment.
Salud.
There's
Ese
been
es
no
uno de
changes
los
in language from
obstáculos.
the Ministry of Health. That is
Lo
one of the
que es la
obstacles.
tenencia
The
de la tierra,
tenants of
ya
the
decía también
land.
la compañera, creo
Our colleague was mentioning it before.
es
I
algo
believe that this
que
is
para los pueblos
something
indígenas
that for
es muy
indigenous
importante,
peoples
porque
is
bien
super
dicen los
important
abuelos, un indígena sin
because our
tierra, un
forefathers
indígena
say
muerto,
this
porque allí es
clearly. An indigenous
nosotros
person without
cultivamos
land is a dead
nuestros alimentos para
indigenous person,
nuestras comunidades
because we
también,
bring
¿verdad?
the food to
Porque
our communities
no
as
es solo
well,
la milpa. Cuando nosotros decimos
because
como
it's not
indígenas, vamos a sembrar
only
la milpa
the
incluye
corn crop.
muchas
We are going
cosas
to
que
plant
la madre
the
tierra nos da.
corn, and
Entonces
this
yo
really
creo que
brings
ahí
so
es
many
donde
things
es uno
that
de los obstáculos.
Mother
Otro de
Earth
los
provides. That's
obstáculos
another of
también
the
es
obstacles. Another
en
obstacle
las
is
escuelas
in
o en las
schools
universidades,
or in
¿verdad? Que
universities,
a veces no se le da la
that
oportunidad
the opportunities
a
sometimes
los jóvenes
not
y a las
given to
mujeres, tanto
young
indígenas como
people and women,
afrodescendientes.
indigenous and
Y
Afro-descendants.
yo creo que sería
I
lo
believe
justo y lo correcto que
that would be
también
fair
más de
and
en
correct, that
algún gobierno, pues
more
no solo nos reconociera,
perhaps
sino
that
también
just some government
respetara
recognizes us,
nuestros
but
derechos
also respected
para
our
que así
rights.
nosotros también podamos
So we
ver
might
que se nos reconoció, pero
see
también tenemos derechos
that recognition,
como
but
indígenas
that we also have
tenemos
rights as indigenous.
esas
We
oportunidades,
have
¿verdad?
those
Que no solo por
opportunities,
ser
right? That it's not only
de la zona
because
rural,
we
por ser
are
mujeres,
from
por
the
ser
rural
indígenas,
area, because we're women,
y
because we're
también a los
indigenous,
hombres,
and also
porque
to the
eso se ve
men,
hasta en las
because
escuelas,
we
se
see
ve
this even in the
la
schools.
discriminación.
We see the
Entonces son
discrimination there.
obstáculos que a
So
veces
these are
llegan hasta nuestra
obstacles that
juventud, porque ellos
sometimes
ya no quieren
reach our
prepararse.
youth
Ellos ya
because
no
they don't
quieren
want to prepare anymore.
seguir
They
estudiando
don't
porque
want
ellos saben que
to
se van a enfrentar
continue
a
studying
a la
because
misma
they know
discriminación.
they'll be facing the same
Y lo
discrimination.
que es a nuestras prácticas es otro
And
obstáculo,
regarding our
porque la
practices,
partera
that's
no
another
puede ejercer su
obstacle
trabajo.
because
Es un
the
obstáculo
midwives
que
cannot do their
se
work.
da
It's an
hasta en nuestros
obstacle
niños,
that takes
que no
place
se
even
puede
with our
curar de
children,
empacho, porque si se
that they
lleva a la
cannot
unidad de
be
salud o
healed
al otro
from
médico, ellos
empacho,
dicen,
because
no,
if they
eso
go
es
to
una infección.
the
Y nuestras abuelas ya saben
the
cómo curar,
health
porque si
centers,
llega que ya le han hecho
and
los
our
remedios para el
mothers already know how
eh,
to heal this.
ya,
There's been some
ya hay
treatment
problemas,
for
¿verdad?
the
Entonces
bad
son
eye. There's
obstáculos que
issues for
como
that.
pueblos
So these are
indígenas debemos
obstacles that
enfrentar.
as
Y
indigenous
si
people we
nosotros
keep
somos
facing.
reconocidos, pues
And
también nos
if we are
reconocieran
recognized, if
esas
we were to be,
prácticas,
our
esos
practices should be
conocimientos.
recognized. Those that know how.
Eso es parte de
That
todos los
is
obstáculos
part
también,
of all
¿verdad?
of the obstacles as
Y
well.
creo que así podemos ir
And I
enumerando
think this way we could really
muchas dificultades o
name many
obstáculos
different
en nuestro caminar,
obstacles in our
¿verdad? En nuestro
path,
idioma,
in our
algo
language,
que
something
eso
that
se fue perdiendo también
has been
con
lost
con
with
toda la persecución
all the
que
persecution
sufrieron los pueblos indígenas.
that the
Creo
indigenous
que ahí
people
es donde
suffered. I
la
think that is
vestimenta,
where
¿verdad?
our
Preferían quizás ponerse
dress,
otra ropa porque sabían
perhaps they chose to
si
wear
lo
different
hacían, pues la
clothing
persecución
because
fue
if they
bastante fuerte
did,
que
because
sufrieron nuestros
persecution
abuelos y nuestras
they
abuelas.
suffered was
Desde ahí
very
venimos
harsh.
nosotros
And
con
from
todos los
there,
obstáculos
we have
para
been facing
poder
all of
con
the
toda
obstacles
libertad decir yo
to,
soy
with all
indígena
liberty,
y
state, I
orgullosos
am
nosotros de
indigenous,
ser
and
indígenas, pero en medio de
proud
tantos
to be
obstáculos,
indigenous, but in
tanta
the face of so
discriminación
many obstacles and discrimination,
y para poder
and
seguir
to be able to
avanzando hemos
continue
tenido
moving
que
forward,
luchar
we have
demasiado
had
fuerte
to struggle
para
too
que
harshly
nuestra identidad
so that
no
our
se pierda, para que
identity
nuestra
is
identidad
not
siga viva.
lost,
Como
so that our
decimos,
identity stays
cortaron
alive.
el
As you
árbol,
were
pero
saying,
quedaron
they
las
cut the
raíces,
tree, but the
¿verdad?
roots
Y la
are
raíz,
still
usted
there.
sabe que
And
cuando
the
hay
roots,
raíces, esa raíz
when
vuelve
there's
a retoñar. Y
roots
aquí estamos y
grow
sabemos
back.
que
And we're
están en nuestras
here, we
comunidades
know that
esos
they're in our
jóvenes que no se
communities.
avergüenzan
We
también en
have
medio de
these young
tanto
people
obstáculo,
who
pero ahí
feel
vamos
no
saltando,
shame
ahí van ellos
to
también
these, with all
luchando
these
y van
obstacles, and they
orgullosos de
keep on
sus
struggling,
raíces como
proud
pueblos
of their
indígenas.
roots as indigenous
Gracias, Alma,
peoples.
por su
Thank
respuesta. Es importante
you
entender la
for
importancia
your
de lo que es el
responses and
desplazamiento, ¿no?
the
Si todos estos
importance
resorts que ahora
of
tenemos no
displacements. All of
existieran,
these
tenemos que
resorts
entender
that we
a quién
find
se
now
desplazó para
were not there
desarrollar ese
before. We have to
tipo
understand
de
who was
infraestructura que
displaced to develop that type of
beneficia económicamente a
infrastructure
sectores
that
muy exclusivos.
benefits very
Heriberto, vamos
exclusive
a pasar contigo con la
groups. We're going to
siguiente
move on with
pregunta.
you, Heriberto, with the
¿Qué rol
upcoming
les debe asumir el
question. What
Estado
roles
al
should the
sistema
state
educativo
play
y los medios de
regarding
comunicación
the
para demostrar
education
el
system
racismo
and
estructural en El
the
Salvador?
media to fight
Bueno, yo
against
creo que
structural
es
racism in El
fundamental la
Salvador?
pregunta
The
que
question
me
is
hace
that you're
y
asking
es
is
que el rol del
fundamental, and it is
Estado
that the
es
role of the
primordial, ¿verdad?
state
Porque
is
el Estado
primordial.
es el que
And
dicta
state
la
dictates
política,
the
digamos, la
policy,
política de Estado,
the
¿verdad? La
state's
política
policies,
pública
public
y, por supuesto,
policies,
desde
and
la
of
escuela
course,
se
from
tiene que
schools,
formar desde, digamos, desde
the
pequeño, desde la primera infancia,
from the
a
first
que hay
ages, there
no
has
que
to be
uno es,
education
digamos,
showing that not that one
así o de
is
esta
this
manera, sino
way
que
or
a
that,
aceptar
but
la
rather
diferencia,
to
¿verdad?
accept
Las
the
diferencias, o
differences,
sea, a
to accept the
reconocer que hay
differences, to
otros y
recognize
otras
that
que son
there's
diferentes a
others
uno.
that are
Y
different
eso,
to
en
us.
ese sentido, creo
And
que
in this sense, I believe it is fundamental that from the school age, schools are give shape to stories, to memory. If we don't do that from schools, it's difficult. It is in the school where they show you to all of these practices in society. Obviously, at home as well, but the school doesn't only enforce it, but has to show it. So I believe the education public policies are very important. And the fact that and I mean we as Salvadorians, that we are, some of those who are in this panel, have to understand that this racism, when we say it's structural, deals with a construct that comes from school. How school has shown us that there are no Afro-descendants in El Salvador, and that indigenous peoples are associated to toiling the land and also being communists, because that's how we were taught. All of this, we have to dismount some of these progress when the 1992 peace accords is that new history books from El Salvador had to be written. And in these new history books, there had to be an openness to look at all these differences. Obviously, 1992 is it's very early, so as to be able to understand many things that we live through today. Well, in a couple of more years. And I believe that that is important. And the other thing is, as Mirna, our colleague Mirna was saying, that there is recognition from the state, but just in paper. It's of no use for there to be recognition that is only there in paper. Why? Because the efforts from the state to bring to Afro and indigenous communities, it is not only in the cultural arena, which is often the case, that they're only moved around to when the president is coming, visiting, this sort of folklorization of the indigenous and Afro-descendants. They have to be policies that that work in favor of the development of the communities. And here, there's a lot to be said. It's not only being spoken about the present, but also the projects that probably from the past had some level of effect, but were not as effective. It's a difficult topic. There are some other national states, for example, in Latin America, that really make an effort for that. But hey, you can see we have the cases very close here in Guatemala, the cases of Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, that have a huge amount of indigenous in Afro-descent populations, but the power is still rooted in not making others different visible. So it's kind of bringing down the bringing down of these barriers, which I think the first thing that has to be brought down are those that do the public policies of the nation states. And I'm going to stop there to be able to continue. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Heriberto. We have the Q&A box very active. And for time constraints, we're going to move on to tending to these questions, and we're going to thank all of you on how to frame these reflections on these powerful thoughts that you have shared. We have organized the questions by blocks. We're going to try to get brief responses from you to be able to cover the as many questions as possible. We're going to begin with you, Heriberto. The racism suffered could influence migration, of course, as Heriberto Mirna was saying it already. In in an indigenous community, young people don't want to be indigenous because they feel discriminated on, and this discrimination is not only an ethnic discrimination, but social, political, economic. And if you want to access, for example, a work position, and Evie was saying this, if you want to access a work position, but you are discriminated because you look or you seem to be indigenous or of Afro-descent, what this does is to look for different spaces where, whatchamacallit, where you're not discriminated somehow. And I don't mean to say that we could use the example of the United States, which is, has a huge amount of discrimination, but also participating with different communities, there's more backing, more support. And there's an interesting thing with Salvadorian people of Afro descent is that they have self-defined, they found Afro-Salvadorians being in a space like the United States because they're able to see and understand themselves. And of course, every form of discrimination in a national territory obviously brings to migration, because if you don't feel well where you're at, well, obviously you're going to move elsewhere. I'm sorry, I know the answer was supposed to be brief. Thank you, Heriberto. Next question is directed to Evie and Mirna. How to address racism in Afro-descendant and indigenous community that has Afro-indigenous roots but doesn't recognize itself. I would ask you to keep brief answers. Mirna, we're going to begin with you.
Le repito la
Por
pregunta.
favor.
Please repeat the
Sí,
question.
no, con gusto.
Yes,
¿Cómo
of
se
course.
aborda
How
el
to
racismo
address
dentro de una
racism
comunidad
in
afrodescendiente? Es
an
decir,
Afro-descendant
cómo
community?
manejamos
How an indigenous community,
el hecho
meaning
de que existe racismo
how
dentro de
to
una
deal
comunidad
with
afrodescendiente
racism in an
indígena que tiene
Afro-indigenous
raíz
community that is
afroindígena, es decir,
that has Afro-indigenous
hay
roots,
una
meaning
presencia afroindígena,
there's
pero no se
Afro-indigenous
reconoce
presence
a sí
but
misma.
does not recognize
Bueno,
itself.
trabajando
Well,
en
working
equipo,
as a
tanto
team,
afrodescendientes como indígenas, uniendo
Afro-descendants and
fuerzas para
indigenous
que
joining
los hermanos
forces
afrodescendientes
so that the
no les
Afro-descendant
son
brothers and
reconocidos, pues
sisters
también
who
los
are not
indígenas tenemos
recognized,
en las comunidades
indigenous people
unirnos
in the communities have
y
to
hacer
come
una sola
together
lucha,
and to
juntos, afrodescendientes
make
como
one
indígenas,
joint
porque
struggle,
también lo hay en
Afro-descendants and
nuestras
indigenous,
comunidades.
because we have that in our communities.
Excelente, gracias. Le repito la pregunta,
Thank you.
Ivy.
Let me repeat the
¿Cómo se
question,
aborda el
Evie.
racismo
How to
dentro de una
address
comunidad
racism
afrodescendiente
in an
indígena que tiene raíz
Afro-indigenous
afroindígena, pero no se
community that
reconoce a
has
sí misma?
Afro roots but does not recognize itself?
Creo que algo que nos ha
I
funcionado
think
a
that something that
nosotros
has
y
worked for
nosotras han
us
sido los procesos
has
formativos.
been
El
formative
poder
processes
hablar
to
con la
be able
niñez, con la
to speak
adolescencia
with
y
children and
promover sobre
teenagers and
todo
to
el
promote especially
autorreconocimiento,
the
que las personas puedan
self-recognition, that
identificar
people might
sus
identify
raíces, por
their
ejemplo,
roots.
construir nuestro
For
árbol
example,
genealógico,
build
hablar de
our
nuestros abuelos, de
family
nuestras
tree to talk
abuelas,
about our
cómo
grandparents, our
eran sus
grandmothers and
prácticas en
grandfathers, what were
medicinas,
their
cómo era
practices
su
with
aspecto
medicine,
físico,
what
y
do they look
preguntarnos si
like.
teníamos un
We
abuelo
asked
morocho, una
if we
abuela
had a
morocha, un abuelo
curly-haired
negro, una abuela
grandfather, a
negra,
black grandfather,
o
a
cuáles eran las
grandmother,
prácticas
what were
ancestrales,
the
las
ancestral
creencias,
practices,
la
beliefs,
espiritualidad de
the
nuestras abuelas
spirituality
indígenas,
of our
y
indigenous
tratar de
grandmothers, and to
fortalecer
try to
esa,
strengthen
esa
that
tenencia ancestral, de
ancestral heritage
visibilizarla, pero
and
creo
make it
que lo más
visible. But
importante
I
ha sido para
think the most
nosotros
important part for us, it has
encaminarnos
been
al
to
autorreconocimiento, porque
uh,
cuando empoderamos
move
a
towards
nosotras y
self-recognition,
nosotros nos
because when
empoderamos
we
y también
empower
incidimos
ourselves
en el
and
empoderamiento de
we
las demás
advocate
hermanas y
in
hermanos,
the
compañeras y
empowerment of
compañeros,
other
hay como
siblings
una
and
mayor
colleagues,
fuerza para
there's more
comprender
strength
toda la
to
violencia que
understand
conlleva el
all the
racismo y la
violence that
discriminación y
racism and
apropiarnos de nuestros saberes
discrimination
y apropiarnos
brings, and take
de
ownership
nuestra
of our
cultura, apropiarnos de
know-how,
nuestra
our
herencia ancestral
culture,
y
our ancestral
promoverla.
heritage,
De
and
esa
to
manera
promote
creo
it.
yo
This
que nos
way,
ha
I
funcionado a
think,
nosotros como
has
organización y también
worked for
como
us as
personas
organization, and
afrodescendientes
also
que nos
as
hemos
people
reconocido
of
y que también esto es
Afro-descent
un
who
gran
have
proceso.
recognized ourselves, and which is also a huge
Gracias
process.
por ayudarnos a
Thank
entender
you
también con
for helping
ejemplos.
us
Hay una
understand
última pregunta
with
de la
examples.
audiencia.
There's
Estamos
another
casi
question
llegando al final.
from
La
the
pregunta la pueden
audience. We're
responder
reaching the end. You
cualquiera de las
can
tres personas
answer any
panelistas.
of the
Va dirigida a
three
ustedes tres.
panelists. This
¿Cómo
is directed to
podemos
all you three. How might
articularnos
we
desde
articulate
organizaciones
ourselves
sociales
from social
independientes
organizations
para fortalecer
independent
acciones
to
conjuntas,
strengthen joint
visibilización
actions,
y
make it
reconocimiento de
visible,
las
and
comunidades
recognizing
afrodescendentes e indígenas
Afro-descendant
en
community
espacios
and
entre
indigenous community in
seminarios desde una
spaces
perspectiva
from
transnacional y
seminars from a
trabajarse como
transnational
tarea? Una pregunta
perspective
bastante
in a
compleja,
communal base. Complex
pero
question,
se la repito.
but I'll
¿Cómo
repeat it.
podemos
How
articularnos
might
desde
we
organizaciones
articulate
sociales
ourselves from
independientes
independent
para
social
fortalecer acciones
organizations to
conjuntas,
strengthen joint
visibilización y
actions,
reconocimiento de las
visibilization,
comunidades
and recognition of
afrodescendientes e indígenas
Afro-descent
en espacios como
communities
este
and indigenous
seminario
communities and in
desde una
spaces such as
perspectiva
this
transnacional
seminary
y de
from
base comunitaria?
a transnational perspective with a
Adelante quien desea
communal
comenzar primero
base
con
or
la respuesta.
grassroots base. Whomever wants to answer the question, go ahead.
Creo que es una excelente
Well, I think
pregunta,
that's an
casi
excellent
pregunta de tesis,
question.
¿verdad?
It's a thesis-like question.
Es compleja, pero
It's
creo
complex,
que
but I
este
think, well,
espacio sirve
this
para eso.
space
Este espacio
helps
sirve para ello.
helps for
¿Por qué?
this.
Porque aquí estamos,
Why?
por
Because
lo
here we
menos,
have at least
visibles, cuatro personas
visible
que
four of us
pertenecemos
who
a
belong
diversos espacios, ¿verdad?
to
Comunidad
different
indígena,
spaces, indigenous communities,
asociación de
it's
afrodescendientes,
Afro-descendants
también
associations,
alianza, o sea,
also
la organización
alliances,
y de la
Alianza, an
academia. Entonces yo
organization,
creo
and
que
the
este tipo de
academy.
espacios
So I think these
acercan
types of
y
space
hace
bring
que nos conozcamos,
together
pues, o
and
sea,
help us
yo sí
know each
creo
other. I
como
do
académico en
believe
las
as an
redes, ¿verdad?
academic in
Y
networks
formular
and
redes de
to
apoyo en
set
cuanto a
up
una
support
temática. Bueno,
networks
hagamos
regarding
una
different
red de apoyo en
topics.
cuanto a la
So let's have
temática
a
de
network of
indígenas y
support for
afrodescendientes y luego
Afro-descendants
pues
and
vamos
indigenous
construyendo
group.
porque
And
finalmente
from then on to
esto
keep
no
on
es de la
building,
noche a la
because
mañana, sino
this
que
is
se va
not something that
construyendo
happens
y
overnight.
teniendo,
It is being
digamos,
built, and
cada uno planteando
everyone
sus
having
objetivos, pero que
their
sean con metas
objectives, but
comunes, ¿verdad?
perhaps with
Aunque
common
luego cada
goals.
quien va a
Although
ir
sometime,
teniendo
although later, everyone will have their
sus diferentes
own
perspectivas en
different
cuanto a lo
perspectives
que
regarding
desean
what
hacer,
they
¿verdad?
want to
Yo
do.
entendería que
I
en el
would
caso
understand
de
that
las
in the
comunidades
case
indígenas, por
of
una parte,
indigenous
los
communities on
afrodescendientes
the
por
one
otra,
side,
o como decía en
Afro-descendants
la
on the
pregunta
other,
anterior, los
or as in the
afroindígenas
previous
por otra
question,
parte.
the
Entonces,
Afro-indigenous on the other.
finalmente es
Finally, there
es ponernos de
is,
acuerdo para
it's all
poder
about
llevar a cabo,
agreeing upon the
digamos, ¿cómo le digo? Llevar a cabo y que se nos haga visibles, que
and
podamos
making it
incidir
happen
en la
and
política
making
pública, porque
the
eso es
advocacy on
importante,
public
porque como sociedad
policy
civil
visible. This
podemos
is
hacerlo,
important
pero
because as public
mientras
civil
el
society, we
Estado
might be here,
no
but as
no
long as
quiera
the state
reconocernos o el
does
Estado
not
no
want to
estar en
recognize
constante
us,
lucha.
we will be in a
Yo creo que eso
continuous
toca estar en una
struggle. And I
constante
think
lucha, ¿verdad?
that's
Como
what
ya
it's
lo
all about, to
decíamos, o sea,
be
la
in a
lucha de
continuous
los pueblos
struggle.
originarios
As
viene
you were
desde
saying, the
hace
struggle of
muchísimo y
indigenous
también desde
people
los
has been ongoing for a
afrodescendientes,
long
¿verdad?
time, and all time, and
Yo creo que
also
por ahí
Afro-descendants.
vendría
And I think that's
la
where
cuestión. Yo sí creo en las redes
it all would
lo
come. I do
primero pues
believe
sería
in
poner una
networks.
red
So
de
one would
apoyo,
be to
¿verdad? De
have a support
entidades, de
network
organizaciones de la
of
sociedad
entities,
civil,
civil
de
society organizations,
comunidades y
communities,
también desde la
and
misma academia,
also
¿verdad?
from the
Creo que es
academy
importante.
itself, academics itself.
Gracias,
I think that's
Heriberto.
important. Thank you,
Compañeras
Heriberto.
Ivy y Mirna,
Evie and
adelante.
Mirna, go
Comenzamos
ahead.
contigo, Ivy, y
We will begin with you, Evie, and I see Mirna wanted to begin. Go ahead, Mirna, and then we'll finish with you, Evie.
Bueno, yo creo que una de las
Well, I
formas
think that one of the
creo que
more
que nos puede funcionar, tanto
like that could
pueblos
work
indígenas como
better for
afrodescendientes,
indigenous and
es
Afro-descendant
hermanarnos
peoples
más,
is
que
to
haya más,
become
más
closer,
acercamiento,
more
¿verdad? Porque yo
more
creo que
brothers and
el
sisters,
hecho que
that
estamos ya
we
acá,
come together.
una
Because
lucha
from
entre
the moment we're
más
here,
esfuerzos haya
when there are
por
more
medio de
efforts
foros,
in a struggle
de
through forums,
conversatorios con nuestros abuelos y abuelas, yo
conversations
creo
with
que eso
our
nos puede llegar
elders,
a funcionar
I
más,
think this
podemos
can really
visibilizarnos
work better. We
más
can make
todavía
ourselves more
y
visible even,
aprovechar estos
and
espacios
to
que,
use
como les
these
repito, no siempre
spaces
los
that, as I
tenemos,
repeat,
¿verdad?
we
Entonces,
don't
así
always
es como
have.
dando estos
So
espacios es
this,
como vamos
like
agarrando
having these
también un
spaces
poquito más
is how we also
de
acquire
valor, decirlo así, ¿verdad? Porque si nunca los
some
tenemos, nosotros
more
nunca vamos
of
a expresar lo que
courage, you
nosotros
could say, because
sentimos
if
o
we don't
queremos,
say, we're never
¿verdad?
going to express what we need, what we
Desde
want
nuestras comunidades.
from our
Y yo creo
from
que
our
esa sería una de
communities, and I think that would be
fundamentales
one of
también,
the very
acercarnos
fundamental
más y ya les
pillars
decía,
to
unir
come together
esfuerzos
and to
para
join
que
efforts
nosotros
so
podamos
as
ser vistos y decir,
to
aquí
be able
estamos,
to be
pueblos
seen and
indígenas
say,
y
indigenous
afrodescendientes, que
people and Afro-descendants,
somos
we're here.
hermanos, somos
We're
de los
siblings.
mismos lugares,
We
así
are
es
all
que
from the same
yo veo
places.
que esto
So
también
I
nos puede
see
ayudar
this can
bastante.
also help us a lot.
Gracias.
Gracias,
Thank
Mirna.
you.
Adelante.
Thank you, Mirna. Go ahead, Evie.
Bueno, creo que ya
Very well. I
mencionaron
think
mucho las
many
compañeras y
things were already
compañeros.
mentioned, both our
Creo
colleagues, but
firmemente en
I
establecer
do
redes de
believe
trabajo, en
honestly
esfuerzos
in
articulados.
establishing network
Creo que no son luchas separadas, que tenemos que
activities,
ser
in
pueblos
articulated
indígenas, pueblos
efforts. We
afrodescendientes.
shouldn't be
Tenemos objetivos en
divided
común que podemos
efforts. We have
trabajar,
common
realizar estos
objectives that we can
esfuerzos
work
en
together
conjunto.
and do these
La
joint
academia nos ha
efforts.
brindado el
Academy has
conocimiento,
provided
han
the
descubierto,
know-how, they've
han
discovered,
recolectado
they have
información de suma
collected
importancia sobre los
information
pueblos
of great
afrodescendientes, porque
importance
es un
about
trabajo
Afro-Indigenous
valioso.
peoples.
Nosotros
It's a very
tenemos la
valuable effort. We
espiritualidad, los pueblos
have the
indígenas afrodescendientes
spirituality,
tenemos nuestra
the
convicción, lo
Indigenous and Afro
reconocemos y tenemos las
original people
metodologías
have the
de actuación
spirituality. We have the
populares
method,
en las
popular education
organizaciones,
methodologies
tenemos
in the
todo ese
organizations.
trabajo
We
que nos
have
ha
all that
permitido
work that has
llegar
allowed
al
to
autorreconocimiento,
bring
participar con
self
otras personas que antes no se
recognition, to
reconocían
participate
como
with
indígenas
others
o
that didn't recognize
afrodescendientes,
themselves
y
as
creo que esa es
indigenous
una
or of
labor
Afro descent.
importante que
And I
podemos
think this
realizar
is
en
important
conjunto,
work that we can do
poniendo a la
jointly,
orden los recursos que tiene
putting
la
our
academia, que
resources in the
tienen las
service,
hermanas indígenas,
the
que tienen las abuelas, que
resources
tienen los pueblos
that our
afrodescendientes,
indigenous
y
siblings, the
alcanzar esos objetivos que
Afro-descendants, the
tenemos en
academy,
común,
and
que
to
están
achieve those
orientados
common
al
goals
desarrollo, al
of
reconocimiento y a la
addressing
justicia
development,
de estas
recognition,
poblaciones que
and the
históricamente han
justice
sido
of these
vulneradas,
people that have
invisibilizadas,
been
negadas y
invisibilized,
violentadas.
denied,
Gracias.
and
Gracias,
um,
Ivy. Y tanto a
violated.
Mirna como a
Thank
Heriberto
you,
por sus
Ivy,
respuestas.
Mirna, and
Definitivamente
Heriberto, for
no hay
your
duda de que
responses.
por medio
Definitely, there's no
de los
effort,
saberes
no
que nos han
doubt that
compartido,
through
sus abuelos,
the
sus abuelas,
know-how
sus personas ancestrales
your
han estado
elders and
definitivamente
ancestors have
acompañándoles para
shared,
que
have definitely been
esa sabiduría
accompanying,
y
so that
ese
that
deseo de continuar
know-how, that
manteniendo viva
desire to
la herencia de los
continue
diferentes pueblos,
the
tanto
heritage of the
indígenas
different
como
peoples
afrodescendientes en El
alive,
Salvador, se
both
siga la conversación.
indigenous and
Agradecemos
Afro-descent in El Salvador, to
sinceramente
have
a
a
cada
continuation
una
of
de
this
las personas que
conversation.
parte de
We
nuestro
definitely
panel
thank everyone who was part
y
of
a
our
todas las personas
panel
que nos han
and
acompañado
everyone
hoy.
who
Esta
has
conversación
accompanied
es
us today.
apenas
This
un paso
conversation
de un
is
proceso más
only
amplio y
one step of
profundo
a
de
larger and
reconocimiento,
deeper
dignificación y
process
transformación.
of
Nos vamos con
recognition
nuevas
and
preguntas e ideas. De hecho, no abordamos todas las
dignification.
preguntas de la
We have a
experiencia,
series of
pero
questions. We have the
entendemos que
questions
esta es una
from a
conversación,
group. We understand that this is
este
a
espacio
conversation.
motiva este
This
tipo de conversaciones
space
que son tan
motivates
necesarias.
these types of
El racismo en El
conversations that are so
Salvador no es
necessary.
un tema
Racism in
del
El
pasado,
Salvador
es
is
una
not a
realidad viva
topic of the
que
past. It's a
exige
living
respuestas
reality
colectivas
that
desde la
demands
memoria,
collective
justicia y la
responses
acción, como no lo
from
han
memory
enfatizado en cada una de
which
sus
has
intervenciones, las personas
has been
panelistas.
emphasized by
Desde el
each of your
seminario
participations
permanente
from the
Mirna
permanent
Colón, Azul
seminary, Mirna
Originario,
Colón, Azul
ONECA, el
Originario,
Foro
ONECA,
Centroamericano de
the Central
Mujeres
American
y
Forum
la
on Women,
18ª Conferencia de
and the
Mujeres
18th Conference of
Afro-Centroamericanas
Afro-Central
y
American
de la
Women,
diáspora.
and
Les
of the
invitamos a
diaspora women.
continuar
We invite
reflexionando,
you to continue reflecting,
organizándose y luchando por
organizing
una
yourselves,
Centroamérica
and
donde quepan
fighting for a Central
todas las
America where
identidades
all of
con
the
igualdad y
identities
respeto. Muchas
with
gracias
equality
y
and
hasta pronto.
respect fit. Thank you very much. See you soon.